He is.
We ready?
Ahead.
Okay.
We ready.
All right.
Madam, Mr. Thompson, you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay. I'm gonna let everybody in. We are.
Okay, well, we're ready to get started. We'll start in about 30 seconds. All right. Well, first, I want to thank everyone for attending us today, attending this very important town hall today. Some of you may or may not be aware, but June is what we call National Home Ownership Month, a very important time, a very important month of the year. And this forum, this town hall comes at a really important time in the country. Many people have been protesting in the streets about racial injustice and inequality in America. And so this town hall about strategies to improve Black home ownership could not come at a more important time in the history of America. In fact, last week was Juneteenth weekend, and Juneteenth is a time that we pause to not only recognize the end of slavery in America, but also about the freedom of African Americans and the unfinished business in America. Some often say that there were two reconstructions, one immediately after the abolition of slavery, at the close of the Civil War, and then the second, some people argue, was during the Civil Rights Movement, when we had a number of laws that were passed in the country to deal with the desegregation of schools, the right to vote, the elimination of legal segregation in housing, the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act, a number of those things over a 30-year period of time. And many have argued that we need a third reconstruction, one that focuses on the economic opportunities. Some, Dr. King talked about civil rights, right? It's one thing for a Black person to be able to go to the lunch counter, but can they buy a meal? It's one thing for you to be able to live in a neighborhood, but can you buy the land? And so today we will have a very distinguished panel that will talk about how do we bridge the 30-point gap in home ownership between Blacks and whites in America. 44% for African Americans, 73% for white Americans. And some would argue that the protests in the street, all those roads lead back to this massive gap in home ownership. So hopefully our panel will be able to talk about some of the problems, but offer a plethora of solutions. Without further ado, I'd like to bring Bishop Gwendolyn Coates. Bishop Gwendolyn Coates is the Bishop of Greater Church of Deliverance out of Long Beach, California. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's my honor and privilege to lead this group into a moment of prayer. I'm going to ask for each of you, if you bow or close your eyes to do that. If you keep your eyes open, do that. Open your hands, because it's time for us to pray. Lord God, we are just honored and blessed to be your children. We're honored and blessed to be in your presence. We thank you, Lord, for this beautiful day. We thank you for this beautiful array of people who have come together, Lord, to talk about strategic plans to help people who have been underserved. People who have tilled the soil and have built the buildings, Lord, are being pressed out of the buildings because of oppression, because of racism, because of strife and unjust situations. And so now, Lord, we are praying for justice. We are praying for openings. We're praying for opportunities. We're praying for this meeting of strategic leaders to come up with a plan to help people get a little piece of the rock. And so, Lord, we thank you that you are our rock. You are our great God. So please, as this meeting goes forth, we invite your presence so that everything that will be said and done will be for your glory. We're looking forward with great anticipation and expectation to home ownership being made available with ease for all of your children and all of your people. Lord, we thank you. We praise you. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Next, I thank you, Bishop, for a very meaningful and inspirational and thoughtful prayer for us. We will follow your directives. Next, we want to bring up the Michelle Calloway, who is the chair of the National Board of Directors for the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, the third woman to hold such a august position, an esteemed position from the great state of Atlanta, Georgia.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and I'm greetings from the Board of Directors. This is such a vital panel that we have today discussing the strategies to improve the rate of Black home ownership. And that is because we understand that home ownership is a gateway to wealth building in the Black community. Things that our home ownership affect are school quality, goods and services that are provided to us, builds a very substantial tax base, and political might. The things that home ownership will also support are business development and business creation. It allows us to send our children to colleges, and it definitely provides psychological and emotional stability within the community. It really provides the avenue to connect individuals to the community that they live in. We know that whomever owns the land controls and dictates the policies. And with that being our basis, this is so important to have this town hall today. NAREB, we are offering and put together under our president, 31st president, President Donnell Williams, what we call the NAREB 8. And I'll just maybe mention 5 or 6 of the programs under NAREB 8. Pardon me. One of them is our House in the Car initiative. And that is a program that's targeted towards the millennial demographic and younger. And what we teach there is financial literacy. We also teach about the ramifications of paying for a car that's overpriced and the impact it may have when you ever owning land, owning that rental property, owning that dream home. No one ever talks about that, but we do. We want to make sure that that demographic is educated because it's a vital growing population in our market today. We also have our civic and faith-based initiative, which means that we work in collaboration and partnership with different associations and groups and churches and other places of worship so that we get the word out in the community about home ownership and change the conversation around wealth building and the like. We also have our investment group, and our investment group really proposes and teaches individuals how to go out and utilize the money that they have to make it work for them and also do good in our communities at the same time, to be not the consumer, but to be the owner of the land. We also have a program for the 48-year plus group. We call it real estate opportunities for seasoned individuals. And we know their concerns are different. We also understand that home ownership, according to numbers, that the average home purchased by African Americans is 48 years old. So we're late in so many ways. This is why we start with the younger demographic, but we also have to minister and teach and train our community that is already 48 plus years old. We also have our professional development, which is the crux of our organization, to make sure that we hand our professionals in the industry, the guardians of making fair housing a reality, the level playing field they need to operate out in the market. And then we have of course, international, because Black people are everywhere. We are everywhere around the world. So we have programs that are really tackling in every way possible, changing that the situation of low rate of Black homeownership. And we are so proud today to host this town hall. I know it's going to be some great information. Thank you, everyone on the panel, and we can get started. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you, thank you. I'm gonna run through really quickly, just so you know, a little information about our panelists. First is Dr. Henry Lewis Taylor. He's a professor, full professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the Center for Urban Studies at the University of Buffalo. Dr. Taylor is a historian and urban planner. He's written several books. He's written several books as well and edited 5 books. And he's been featured in a number of publications, including New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and et cetera, and even Time Magazine. Nikitra Bailey serves as an executive vice president at the Center for Responsible Lending, is a research and policy advocacy organization that seeks to build a fair and more inclusive financial services marketplace. She's also testified before Congress on housing finance reform and mortgage lending discrimination. She holds a JD from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and a BA from Pennsylvania State University. David Clooney is executive director of the Black Economic Alliance, the nation's only coalition of business leaders and aligned advocates committed to economic progress and prosperity in the Black community. From the Obama administration, where he helped advance economic policies to improve the lives of all Americans, to JP Morgan and Chase, where he helped lead the firm's engagement with policymakers across the country to expand economic growth. David brings a wealth of invaluable experience. He's also, he is a graduate of Howard University School of Law and the University of Albany, State University of New York, at University of Albany, part of the SUNY system. Dr. Rodney Harrell. Rodney is a vice president of family, home, and community at AARP, leading their Public Policy Institute team on issues related to family caregiving and livable communities. His research on housing preferences, neighborhood choice, and community livability are integral to the world-renowned AARP Livable Ability Index. Rodney is a graduate of Howard University. He earned his dual master's degree in public affairs and urban planning from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University and received his PhD in urban planning from the University of Maryland. All right, we have some folks with some credentials. Just in case y'all watching, we got some smart Black folks on this thing here. W.B. Du Bois would be very proud of you all. All right, so let's get right into it. I want to start first with give Dr. Henry Taylor about 3 to 5 minutes to really talk about some of the strategy, what the problem, but most importantly, some of the strategies to deal with this ocean of Black homeownership, gap in Black homeownership in the United States of America. Dr. Henry Taylor.
Thank you, Antoine, and I'm very happy to be here with everyone today. And the idea of significantly increasing Black homeownership is a bold, revolutionary idea, and it will be extraordinarily challenging one to achieve. And why is this the case? Over the past 70 years, there's been very little growth in the proportion of Blacks owning their own homes. For example, in 1950, when the mass home ownership movement was really launched, the Black home ownership rate was 34.4%. 20 years later, after millions of African Americans had migrated to urban centers and farming as a way of life had disappeared, the Black home ownership rate had climbed just 7.2 percentage points to 41.2. And for all intents and purposes, it's been stuck there ever since. Over the past 50 years, there has been virtually no sustainable growth in Black home ownership. Fast forward to 2020, and we find the current Black home ownership rate is only 44%, virtually the same as it was 50 years ago back in 1970. Not only this, but many of these Black-owned houses are located in neighborhoods where property values appreciate very slowly, if they appreciate at all. Thus, overall, the value of Black homes is much less than that of white. I mention these issues because these are the things that we have to confront head on if we're to win this challenge of increasing Black home ownership. And then against this backdrop, I want to outline 4 fundamental things I think we have to do in order to make that increase happen. First, Blacks have to be given access to equitable mortgage and lending practices. Can't emphasize that enough. Historically, Blacks have not just been redlined and discriminated against, but we have been exploited by the real estate and banking industries. In the 1950s and 60s, African Americans were victimized by housing contract buying. Then after 1968, they were exploited by the HUD, FHA, public-private partnerships that swindled Blacks out of millions. And more recently, Blacks were hit hard by subprime mortgage debacle. So our first step, we have got to ensure fair and equitable lending among Blacks. And I know that Ms. Bailey is going to hit hard on that issue. Secondly, and very closely related to this, we've got to develop a strategy to protect Blacks against the loss of their homes through foreclosures, including those that are caused by delinquent taxes. If we do nothing else but allow Blacks to keep the houses they have without losing them through foreclosure, we increase the home ownership rate. So that's a critical issue that we have to be able to do. Third, we have to develop a strategy to recreate and regenerate the neighborhoods in which Blacks are located, including making substantial improvements in rental properties. Concurrently, and at the same time that we do this, we have to develop strategies to keep Blacks from acquiring underwater mortgages, ending up in situations where they owe more than the house is actually worth. Finally, we have to popularize collective forms of ownership, including cooperatives and limited dividend housing and co-housing. The median household income for African Americans in the United States is only about $41,000. That's the lowest among all of the groups. So we have a lot of people that are not going to qualify for owning single family homes. We have to confront that, but through various forms of cooperative ownerships, they can become owners. And most important, as Ms. Calloway said, allow them to gain control over the spaces in which they live. I mentioned this because the only way for many people that the value of their homes increases is to increase the value of the neighborhoods in which they are situated. And I'm going to stop on that note.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you. We appreciate your powerful statements. We're going to come back to you in a few minutes. And then I know we're having some technical difficulty. I'm not sure who's adjusting the camera. At least my screen keeps moving back and forward.
Dr. Taylor, when you speak, your camera zooms in and out.
That's just my cam.
Okay.
When the university told us we were going to a remote situation, and I was shifting my office from the campus to my home, they bought me a cheap cam.
Oh, okay. I didn't know what was going on.
No, that's the cheapness of the University of Buffalo buying a brother a cheap cam. Now, I know the white folks got a better cam, but structural racism comes all the way down to the cam that they'll give a brother to take home.
Okay, we were wondering what was going on. All right, that's all. We're going to go to Nikitra Bailey. Thank you, Nikitra.
Thank you, Antoine and Chair Calloway, for this opportunity to be here today to participate in this really important discussion. We are at a point of reckoning in our country. Our nation's discriminatory practices in housing are at the root of many of the injustices that we see people lead in protests calling for repair for. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic is falling disproportionately on Black communities because of this structural discrimination. So structural and historic discrimination has left our families more vulnerable, as Dr. Taylor said, going into the 2008 housing crisis. And that crisis and the response to it actually left us worse off. Our communities, along with Latino communities, lost $1 trillion from the foreclosure crisis. Many of those foreclosures should not have happened because many of our borrowers were actually able to qualify for better price credit that was much cheaper than what they actually received, and were steered into really dangerous mortgages that were going to explode because there was an incentive for the mortgage brokers to get a kickback from those mortgages. So that crisis has left us worse off, and now here we go with COVID-19 being hit hardest again. So what we have to do this time is we have to focus on addressing the long-term structural flaws that perpetuate this inequality. And this discrimination actually costs our overall economy. Black Americans who face discrimination are not only feeling this burden, about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion are pulled out from our GDP because of the cost of this discrimination. And according to McKinsey and Company, we would actually see our GDP rise by 4 to 6 percentage points if this discrimination was no longer happening in the marketplace. We also see the mortgage market actually tightening right now, which is really scary because, as Dr. Taylor mentioned, we're back at 44% homeownership rate, which is actually an uptick from where we were following the Great Recession, where we really hit those record lows. So we have to be really careful to make sure that that tightening in the marketplace does not leave Black families behind. We also know, as Dr. Taylor mentioned, that we don't have the same levels of home equity because our communities have been undervalued because of redlining. So right now, many families are going to be able to tap into home equity to really help weather some of their financial storms. But for Black families, that's going to be a challenge because those families don't have the same levels of home equity. So what we have to do right now is we've got to fight like hell for fair housing enforcement. HUD is making an attempt to really roll back its disparate impact rule. If we lose disparate impact at HUD, we will lose a critical civil rights tool that has really, made the mortgage market fairer, and that has provided an opportunity for the nation to deliver on its promise of fairness and opportunity. We also have to be very careful right now to make sure there isn't a disruption in the housing sector. Housing accounts for about 20% of our overall GDP. And there are some provisions in the HEROES Act that need to be passed right now. So my ask of everyone on this call today is to contact your senators. Let them know immediately that the $100 billion that has been allocated for rental and the $75 billion that has been allocated for home ownership must pass now. Because of the history of redlining and exclusion, we are not at the same levels of home ownership as white families, so there are more Black renters. If those renters don't have the financial resources to sustain themselves, they won't have the ability to save for down payments, and that could have drastic ramifications. We also don't need to allow the provisions that were enacted in the CARES Act that are providing assistance for loan forbearance that has already been referenced to go away. We need this assistance to go on throughout the crisis. So I really implore you all, pick up the phone, send an email right now, and let the Senate know to pass the HEROES Act and those important provisions that are in it. And then finally, I am going to say, let's be bold. Like, federal policies got us into this mess. It's time for federal policies to get us out of this mess. We need a GSE restorative home loan guarantee program. The GSEs right now, their activity for Black home ownership is only at 4% out of $256 billion. It's time for us to get supported down payment assistance from those programs so that we can make sure African Americans get the opportunity to own their homes and to sustain in those homes. And we also have to stop equating race with risk. We know that credit scoring factors in discrimination and it favors wealth. Well, if federal policies help white families build wealth over time and did not do the same thing for Black families, we've got to throw those things out because they're not allowing these kind of neutral ways for policy determinations to be made. They're actually harming African Americans and hurting them because of those historic practices that really hurt our opportunity to participate fairly in the economy overall. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to talking more with you all soon.
We're going to really get into that in the questions in a few minutes about whether or not the system it wasn't designed for us, and that's why it doesn't work for us. So, but we're going to come back. Let me go next. We're going to go over to David Clooney to talk about the economics of Black home ownership and why it matters. David.
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you for having me. Dr. Taylor, I actually thought that was intentional and you had a dramatic camera effect going on. I was kind of jealous. I should lean into it. It really added to the presentation. And I will apologize in advance. I am in Harlem, New York, where there have been 2 battling car alarms going on outside my window on 10 for about the last half hour. So if you hear that, I will try to speak over it. But I'm the executive director of the Black Economic Alliance. It's an organization that was started just a few years ago because out of a reality that Black folks, we are having a completely unacceptable set of economic outcomes across the board. And so business leaders came together and said, okay, what can we do, to leverage our collective dollars, political influence, expertise, and really start to change outcomes, both from a public policy perspective, but also on the private sector side. So the moment we're living through currently is an opportune one. And obviously it is terrible how we got here, but we're having a very necessary conversation about the systemic nature of what racism and what systemic injustice has done to create the current situation we're in. So one of the things we talk about often is Black folks, Black families are earning, and this is before the pandemic, 1/10 the annual income of their white counterparts. And that 1/10 is about $17,000 to the average white family at $171,000, which, by the way, that is below the poverty line. So that's a huge problem to start. But the Black Economic Alliance, we have a slogan, work, wages, and wealth, which are really the 3 key areas we focus on. And you think about all 3 of these, how much home ownership ties into all of them and your living situation ties into all. So the thing about work, being able to live somewhere where you have access to a good paying job and that you are not, I said I live in Harlem. There are many people in New York and other cities who are paying over 50% of their income to rent where they're living. So that's a double negative where they're, putting out way more than they should be and just don't have the opportunity to build wealth because they are renting and because they're paying so much out of pocket, for a rental, not even home ownership. And that we Black folks are over-indexed in that category of folks in wages. Again, not being able to earn a living wage, which then makes you, not credit worthy as a borrower. And we know that there is a huge wage gap between Black folks and our white counterparts. And then wealth is really the key to this whole discussion, which is homeownership has been the single largest builder and determinant of wealth for American families throughout our country's history. And I think about the time we're in now where we're going through this major both reckoning on racial injustice, but also we are about to see a completely different economy than we've ever seen. We should stop talking about coming back to the economy that we left, just a few months ago before the pandemic started, but what the new economy is going to look like and how we plan and really lean into it. So I think about the sets of policies that Congress is passing now, things like the CARES Act, the HEROES Act came out of the House. These bills are unprecedented. This is the most money we've ever spent, at one time. And I compare that to the New Deal after the Great Depression and what was really a raw deal for Black folks, particularly with things like the National Housing Act in 1934, where Black folks were categorically excluded from getting mortgage-backed or government-backed mortgages for over 30 years. And so while you had white folks building all this wealth over 30-something years, Black folks legally could not get access to these loans. And then, when the Fair Housing Act came in and that was done away with, you still had redlining that happened for generations, and it's still happening now in different ways. So one of the ways I think we need, there are a lot of things we're going to talk about in the question, so I'll be brief. But one of the things I think we need to take advantage of in this current moment is calling out the situation for what it is. And I compare home ownership and how we can do it around home ownership with respect to race, similar to a conversation I had with a cab driver many years ago in New York, where I had a very hard time getting a cab, which was a typical experience for a Black man. And I got in and I said, my man, why don't y'all pick up Black people? And for about the next 30 minutes, we had one of the most enlightening conversations I've ever had. He was an Arabic gentleman, and he was very honest with me. And he said, we're concerned. I said, is it because you're concerned that I'm going to take you far out of your way? Are you concerned you might get robbed? Are you concerned, about the neighborhood I'm going to take you to, or that you're going to be far out and not be able to come back? If you're going to the Bronx, he's dropping me off in the Bronx at the time. He said all the above, unfortunately. And he talked about how it is a very well-known thing among the industry. And I think if you ask a similar question to folks in the real estate industry, particularly mortgage bankers or mortgage brokers and others, you will get a similar response, which is yes, Black folks, it is more expensive to do business with them. It is riskier. We just don't like doing it as much for a number of reasons. And I think if we start from a place of recognition, it will help us be prescriptive in prescribing and assigning equitable solutions that actually start to address the problem for what it is. So I look forward to getting into the questions, but I think it's important for us now that we're at a place where we're much more comfortable than we've ever been in my lifetime anyway, talking about race and how it impacts every aspect of American life, that needs to be part of the conversation about how we fix this problem.
Thank you, thank you. I want to go to Dr. Rodney Harrell, but Dr. Taylor, I want you, don't answer now, but I want you or Nikitra to talk about in one of your responses what the home ownership rate was for whites and Blacks. You talked about what the Black ownership rate was in 1934, but you didn't talk about what the white ownership rate, because the people need to know how close the home ownership was at that before white folks got help. All right, colleges grew and white home ownership grew at an exponential rate as a result of that. Y'all got to tell the numbers. So let me go to Rodney. We're going to come back. Thanks.
Sure, and I want to talk about a couple of things, and I'll touch on them quickly. First, I want to really have us think about what housing really means. We've talked about the wealth impacts of housing and how important that is, but housing also is other things. Of course, it's shelter. It keeps you dry from the rain, but it's also a platform for many things. It helps us to raise our families, to keep our memories there. It's our connection that takes us to things in our neighborhood, our community, that gets us to work and the like. And so I want us to make sure we think about the holistic piece of housing and what it brings to our lives. And that's part of what we talk about when we have a livable communities approach. The idea that you need all of the options to make sure that you can live your best life regardless of your age or your income or your physical ability. And what we've talked a lot about in the first 3 talks today are about some of the barriers that are there. And barriers that were historic or well-known, the redlining and the financial challenges that have been there. However, some of those challenges are still there. We have zoning challenges and zoning barriers that prevent us from creating a range of housing options that folks need. And those are the kind of barriers that we need to start thinking about that are continuing to be there. The continuing effects of these past and current issues are there and impacting communities. We also need to think about this at both the personal level and the community level, right? That we're talking a lot about the mortgage products and things that an individual might get. But what happens when several people in a community, several homeowners face foreclosure at the same time? I live in Prince George's County, Maryland, where many communities, many neighborhoods have dealt with the mass of foreclosures. And frankly, some are still recovering from the late 2000s recession to this day. So we need to think about the place where these things are, not just on the individual and economic impacts, but then those wider impacts as well. And in doing that, we need to really think about some of the other pieces of the puzzle as we move forward. We talked a little bit about the Fair Housing Act and the government's role in not just preserving fair housing, but I want to talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing. The idea that we should be moving forward to create more opportunities. We can do that at all levels of government. I think we might talk a little bit about that later, but in general, I'll say I'm a big fan of the policy actions we can do to help expand the housing choice that people have and reflect on the fact that housing provides different benefits for different individuals and different families, and that particularly for African-American families, the choices are limited. I did my dissertation research on segregation in a modern day and noted that many African-Americans had compromised choice, that they couldn't quite find the options they need. And then if they could, they couldn't afford it. And if they could afford it, maybe it wasn't in their community or there's some other issue, there's some other barrier in place. And so what we can do is we can start to tear down some of those barriers. We can start to hit the financial barriers, hit the continuing discrimination and racial steering towards mortgage products and housing solutions that don't work. We can knock down some of those barriers that we see that are preventing homeownership. Those are the kinds of steps we need to take to make sure that the people that want and deserve and need homeownership options are getting them. And I hope that we can talk about those issues and figure out ways to make that happen into the future.
Thank you. Great, lot of great points. I want to go to Nikitra first, and we'll come back over to Dr. Taylor. This was homeownership biases, and this gap was the creation of the federal government. So we believe that in order to make significant changes, it will require a federal solution, right? So Nikitra, if you could, what are a couple of the barriers that you think that the federal government should do that's institutional in nature that can help improve Black homeownership? And Dr. Taylor, if you can do the same as well.
Thanks, Antoine. So we know that for the first 35 years of the FHA insured program, only 2% of those mortgages, those were government-backed mortgages that had low down payments. And communities like Levittown, New York, where people purchased homes for probably about the time $7,000. And over time, those homes are likely to cost in the upwards of about $400,000 to $500,000 today. So only 2% of those dollars, which totaled about $120 billion for 30 years, went to white families and gave them a head start in becoming homeowners. African Americans did not have that same opportunity. So we need to have the same type of access. And that's why we're calling for the Restorative Justice GSE Home Loan Guarantee. We've got to invest in Black communities in the same way with the same vanilla products. Oftentimes when people come to our communities, they want to come with these creative approaches. The reality is we never had access to the plain vanilla product without discriminatory actions. We went from redlining to subprime abusive lending because our communities were credit starved. We started getting the fringe credit. So that's what led to the downward trend in the subprime crisis. And many people who qualified, and I can't say this enough, many people who would have qualified for loans that were much cheaper were stared into dangerous mortgages because they would explode. The second thing that we've got to do is we've got to call for blanket forgiveness for student loan debt. We know that
I think she froze up. We're going to go to Dr.
that has been created in the housing market, and we could not. So we're asking for at least a $10,000 blanket cancellation of student loan debt. This will go a great way to help students that attend our HBCUs all across America.
Thank you. Dr. Taylor, you want to tell us what that Black homeownership, white homeownership rate was in the 30s and 40s compared to, and how government helped white folks? Everybody think they pulled themselves by their own bootstraps. That's a myth. That's a myth in America.
Let me hit on a couple of things. In terms of the home ownership rates, back in 1950, and I want to stress, mass home ownership is a post-World War II phenomenon. The type of home ownership that existed prior to that was was not the type of profit-based homeownership that we're talking about. So that becomes critical. We're talking about post-World War II. And so for me, 1950, following the war, is the benchmark. We were at 34.4. Whites at that particular period of time were at 55% home ownership. We fast forward to 1970, they had jumped to 65%. And then from 70, they jumped to 73. So there's been a flatlining at 73 for some time now. But the distinction has been almost 50% of a difference. But here's the real critical difference, not just the home ownership rate. And this is something that we have to wrap our heads around. Myself and others refer to it as segronomics. And segronomics is the thing that we have to understand. The valuation of white residential space is determined by the devaluation of Black space. Housing go down as the percentage of Blacks increase. White exclusivity allows the banking and real estate industry to inflate those costs. So white resistance to integration is centered around the reality that if you integrate these white spaces with Blacks and other people of color, you intermingle them. Then if you intermingle housing by cost and type, which would accompany such an intermingling, the real estate market and valuation as we know it would be altered in fundamental ways.
All right, thank you.
Fundamental. So racial segregation and racial segregation on devalued Black space is the secret to white value. The other thing I want to say is that at the federal level, we have to build powerful safeguards. You've got to look at what happened with the HUD FHA movement, because there were guaranteed loans. And with these guaranteed loans, what these bankers and realtors did, they turned risk into an asset. They said the riskier the loan, the more profitability, because they were predicting that Blacks would miss payments, they would foreclose. And the African-American community during that, after 68, became a golden goose of profitability for the real estate and banking industry. I won't talk about that much more, but I urge you to read my daughter's book, Race for Profits: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership. Because it details in great details that particular period of time. Race for Profits by Keeanga Taylor. And that book was also a finalist this year for the Pulitzer Prize in History. So it's a hot, well done book, much better than I could have done.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to take a Facebook question and then I'm going to come back to another one. So I'm going to go to David Clooney and Dr. Rodney Harrell. This question is, how can the effects of redlining be reversed? What can we do to, we've seen a lot of books put out. His daughter has a book. There's a color of law book. There are a number of books out there about the effects of redlining. And some will say it doesn't exist, but live in a Black neighborhood and your insurance rate is higher. If your credit is low, but you still don't have any car accidents, your car and property insurance, everything is higher, because as my good fraternity brother Sean Rochester calls it, the Black tax. So what can we do, David and Dr. Harrell? What can we do about the reverse redlining?
So I'll start and I'll pass it to you, Dr. Harrell. You know, I talked about it a little bit earlier, being very pointed in our response. You know, one of the challenges here is, you know, Congress is unwilling to and says they can't by law make things, and in some cases they can't, targeted by race. But we know that
they do it for Native Americans. They got the Native American HUD Section 184 that gives them certain mortgage guarantees. Why can't we fight for that for Black people?
So I was going to say, I think we need to expand our thinking and think outside the box about what's possible, especially at this moment where we're having this, again, you know, reckoning on what race has meant throughout the entire history of the United States. And even before that, Ms. Bailey, Nikitra Bailey talked about it earlier, credit is a big problem. And I think the kind of unfair and unequal treatment of Black folks from a credit perspective, from a risk perspective. So I think it's being targeted with the solutions. And also one of the things we need to change on the private sector side is the perception about doing business with Black businesses. And this is, I think, within our community and outside of our community as well. You know, the term, the white man's ice is colder, is something we really need to turn around. And I think we're at a point where we've seen enough examples of gentrification, for example, to see how lucrative it is to invest in a community of color. You know, unfortunately, what Dr. Taylor said is right. Once that community of color becomes less of color, the property values go up and your investment goes longer. But I think changing the perception of what it means to make Black investments, and I will say, I've experienced this in the last few weeks. Both corporations and people from outside of the Black community have been more interested than I've ever seen in investing in Black causes, Black businesses, Black organizations. And I think having that focus on what the solution is to reversing the impacts of redlining will really help actually make sure the solution reaches its intended outcome. And I will say one last thing. One of the big things the Black Economic Alliance tries to message on is the benefit to the entire economy of the Black economy doing better, of Black Americans doing better, and home ownership as a linchpin of increasing both local economies and the U.S. economy's performance, and even what it means to our GDP, I think is a helpful way to make this, you know, a nonpartisan, just an inclusive issue that everybody can get behind.
Hey, Dr. Harrell.
Yep, and you know, the Fair Housing Act is one of my favorite pieces of legislation. But 50 years ago, we're still seeing some of those impacts today. Over 50 years ago, 52. And so what we have to do is first acknowledge that those impacts are still there. The communities that were redlined as hazardous back then are the communities that are largely lived in by African American and other people of color today in many cities across the country. And so once we understand that some of the disinvestment and other issues that have proceeded or that have succeeded over those 50 years are based on that, then we can start to look at those solutions. And so we've talked about some of the opening of products and making sure that people can have access to the kinds of finance and other issues that finance and other products that can help them to purchase homes where they like. But we also need to worry about the information gap. One of the reasons we came up with the livability index was that we saw that many people did not know much about what was happening on the other side of town. So you're in your formerly redlined neighborhood and with all of the issues and other features that are there or not there, and you don't necessarily know that there may be other options on the other side of town. So giving us information to know those things is a step. But if you're going to buy that home, you don't want to be steered away from it by a real estate agent or any other advisor that may be pushing you away from the type of opportunities that you may want. So addressing the fact that steering still exists to this day, as we've seen in recent reports, is another thing that we can do to start to tackle those effects and get there. And then finally, we could start to look at the impacts of zoning. And I mentioned that earlier, and Dr. Taylor mentioned some of the co-housing, some of those other options. And one of the impacts that's our legacy is that we have zoning that's limited the options in many communities, and many African-American communities specifically, and frankly, in many majority white communities. And so by expanding the types of options of housing that could be built. We mentioned co-housing. We look very closely at how accessory dwelling units can expand the wealth building opportunities and opportunities for caregiving and other issues as well. But they're not legal in many communities to build, or there's zoning barriers that are put up that prevent people from being able to get those options built that can enhance their wealth and provide more options for people that are trying to look for homes. So we need to address those barriers as well. So really taking a place-based approach and that people-based approach to really attack the issue is a way we can move forward.
All right, we're going to do real quick answers, okay? So I'm going to call on, this next question is going to be for Nikita Bailey. It's a federal question. There's a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. What can we give one thing that you'd like to see in that bill that can improve Black home ownership?
More support for down payment assistance. We need to have dollars. There was a Marshall Plan that built America after the Great Depression, and a lot of money was invested through homeownership. Our families and our communities couldn't get access to it, so we need to see those dollars. The Black-white wealth gap is at a place where whites have 10 times the wealth of Black people because of those homeownership investments related to those redlining policies.
Thank you. This is a quick one for you, Dr. Taylor. Mayors and governors can play a significant role in increasing Black home ownership. What is the one thing that the mayors across the country should be doing to help Black home ownership in their city?
I think the key, and the mayors and the governors could fight for this at a national level, but from their end, we need to develop a package, a guaranteed loan package with a non-foreclosure clause, a guaranteed loan package with a non-foreclosure clause. The non-foreclosure clause eliminates the unscrupulous types of activities that are involved. We have to be bold. And if we could push for something like that guaranteed loan that Ms. Bailey has been talking about, and add to that the non-foreclosure clause, we are now in business. The private sector will come to it because the mortgage money is guaranteed. The dollars flow in. Blacks can't be tricked out of their house because we have a non-foreclosure clause. I'd ask the mayors and the governors to fight for that.
Thank you. Hey, David, one of the things that you represent a lot of Black business people. There's this myth that one, there's not land in cities. There's a lot of vacant lots in cities. There's a lot of vacant houses in cities. There's a lot of government-owned buildings every year that are foreclosed on. But we also need, so that represents opportunity to put people in those homes. The other thing, David, I want you to talk about quickly is we need more Black builders and developers, right? What do you think we can do to create a pipeline? There are a lot of Black builders. I know our association has a lot of Black builders. We need to go across the country helping Black builders build Black houses for Black people in the country. What's your thought about that?
So absolutely right. And I think, a lot of companies have been saying, what can I do? What can I do? I think creating a fund to invest in, Black builders, Black construction companies, and a fund that steers, Black homeowners into homes is something that there would be an unprecedented level of interest in. You have a number of funds and different businesses and finance vehicles being set up to do different things that benefit the Black community. Goldman Sachs just put out something called the Racial Equity Fund that we are, the Black Economic Alliance is one of the partners in. We have a number of other, be it financial institutions or other institutions looking for ways to support Black wealth building. I think that would be a huge boon to the economy and a huge boon to, move the needle on this issue by having private sector companies create these funds that have very specific outcomes, and they don't have the restrictions of the government to be specifically focused on Black contractors, Black builders, and Black people getting into homes as well.
Great. Rodney, you talk a lot about livable communities, and it's really, when I was on the city council, they used to have this thing called the Neighborhood Conditions Index that they use for HUD, for public planning purposes. But one of the things I want you to kind of share with us, there's a myth that AARP only deals with seniors, and that's not true. There are over 1 million Black millennials in the United States of America that make over $100,000 a year and they're renting. What do you think we should be doing and advocating for to get those Black millennials onto the road of home ownership? They don't have bad credit. They got a good credit score according to Freddie Mac, but no one's talking to them. NAREB is trying to do it. We can't do it alone. What do you think needs to do? And I'm gonna come back to Dr. Taylor and David, because this is a historic moment. Rodney, what do you think we should be doing to get those Black millennials onto the path of home ownership? And they're ready. I mean, they got the money, they got the job, they got the car, but they don't have a house.
Right. So that's a great question. And I think it's one that gets at kind of a bigger part of our conversation today. We've talked a lot about policymakers. We've just talked about some of the private sector, and now we're talking about individuals. I mean, all of those different spheres have a role to play in making sure that we get our housing needs met. And so as we talk about housing, one of the biggest things to understand is that it's a lifetime decision process, right? That housing decisions can impact us over many, many years. And so we've talked about some of the wealth building benefits, but we have also, as we're talking about housing options and ways to get into housing and meeting our not only current needs, but long-term needs, we're talking to all age ranges. The idea that we should be purchasing options that have the features we need as we age, that have the connections to work, that have the financial benefits of homeownership and wealth. Thinking about housing as a holistic decision that impacts many facets of your life is the way to go. And so as I talk to folks out in the community, I talked about the wide range of housing benefits and really how it can impact you and your family, not just today, but into the future. I think once you talk to people about in those terms, they start to make the decisions that take long-term impacts into account.
David, you're a young guy. You're a young guy.
I appreciate that.
You're a young guy. You know, I lost my hair in City Hall in Buffalo. But what do we need to do to motivate these over 1 million young people? We got a whole campaign, housed in the car. What do we need to do? And you're speaking to a lot of CEOs of private Black and white companies. How do we get them on fire about getting Black people to own property?
I think it's changing the messaging around home ownership as an investment. And as Dr. Harrell talked about, a long-term investment. I think one of the things that I've noticed with millennials is unattractive about home ownership is that they feel like it ties them down. They want to be transient. They want to be able to live in one city, travel to 10 others for work, or be in one city for 6 months, be in another city for a few months. And I think it's showing them examples of people who have used home ownership as an anchor for their financial portfolio, and they've been able to use it as an investment vehicle, as something that generates income if they're renting out to other people. If they live, for example, in New York, one of the things that's attractive to do here, to the extent you can get the capital to do it, is buy a multi-unit place, live in one of the units, rent out the others. You're taking away your own ability to have to, have a high rent, or in some cases you might get your rent paid for, but it's an investment both in the short term and long term. So I think messaging to millennials in language they understand about, they say, oh, I don't want to invest in housing because it's not, they've seen enough people come before them make investments and end up underwater. I think it's showing them how to invest in a smart way, but also giving them the flexibility that they feel like they can do what they want to do and not have to be tied down to one house, one city, in one place for 30 more years.
Dr. Taylor, back in the day I worked for you. You were working on a number of initiatives, Fruit Belt in Buffalo, MLK neighborhood planning. What do we got to do to get white folks to see the value investing in neighborhood development from a home ownership perspective again, and bringing our young people with them? What's your thoughts on that?
I think that we have to reimagine the neighborhoods and communities in which we live. We have to rethink of and recreate them. We have to imagine very different but possible neighborhoods and communities. And going back to a point we had talked about earlier, we have to plan for these communities. In neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood that I visit, there's no plan for it. And so home ownerships are a part of a bundle of a neighborhood. They're all linked and interconnected. So we have to reimagine the Black spaces that we occupy. It goes back to what Rodney had said earlier. We have to understand the kind of places and think of the highly energetic and exciting places that we want to build and root the home ownership framework within that framework. We also get the millennials about it. Millennials are imagining a new world. Most of us are stuck in an old world, looking backwards, they're looking forward. So we have to embrace this uncreated future. This minute that we're living in now is a revolutionary moment. Yesterday is gone, it's never coming back. What next has yet to be created. So in this kind of transitional space, we need to think bold, because I gotta tell you, things that we wouldn't even dare think about 3 weeks ago are possible today. And I think if we pass that energy on to our young folks, and if we work with them to reimagine the spaces that we occupy, we will see how home ownership in a new environment becomes an anchor for a new world.
Thank you. We only got a couple minutes left. We're actually at 2:01. We're going to go probably about 5 to 7 minutes. In your closing comments, I want to just share a few things that people have raised. And if each of you can find something that's relevant to you, I want to thank David for being, I know he had to run, but a couple of things that have come up. One is about the issue of getting more African Americans in higher levels in the mortgage industry. We're going to talk about that next week with some top leaders in the space, but also the issue about some of the laws that were designed to help whites. We need to be revolutionary in our thoughts. You know, Land Act, Homestead Act, and all these. And I love what you said, Nikitra, about the restorative lending. Right? We have laws on the books that are race-based for Native Americans. If Donnell Williams was on the phone, who's our national president, he would say that Native Americans' land was stolen, but we represent a stolen people. In the same way, no one has a problem helping Native Americans because of their pain. African Americans need to have that same passion for our people. Hey, Mr. Williams, how you doing?
I'm all right. I only got a couple minutes, but I would say stolen land, stolen people. What's the difference? And we need to draft something up, have something drafted up so that we are compensated or made whole. We should be made whole as well.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to come back to you, get the closing comments. I'm going to give each of you 2 minutes to wrap up, and then we're going to give some final remarks from President Williams. I know we got a lot of stuff in the chat box right now. We're going to have a whole series on this all year. So I know every time we do this, we've got hundreds of people watching. But we're going to go back in the order that we started. So we'll go with Dr. Taylor first, and then we'll go back to the next two speakers. Dr. Taylor.
In closing, both you and Brother Williams made a point about stolen people and Native Americans about stolen land. I want to add a dimension to that. African American people played the driving role in the winning of the Civil War. Some 200,000 fought in that war. 40,000 died. 25 won the Congressional Medal of Honor. A combination of their bravery on the battlefield and the insurrections that were occurring on the plantations is what made the Northern victory over the South possible. The racist Northerners then turned over the South, the land and the wealth and the power, to the Confederate traitors who had carried this country on a reckless war that led to 620,000 people died. The wealth of the South belongs to Black people. They stole us and they stole the land and the wealth that we created. I want to close by saying we have to build safeguards into these lending practices. We move from a place of exclusion to predatory inclusion. We're being preyed upon and are sources of profits for others. So we have to design safeguards into these lending practices that will protect us from these predators who have built us for millions and billions. And I'll close on that, Antoine. Safeguards within these lending structures.
Teacher Bailey.
We actually have safeguards, and I'm so grateful for that point from Dr. Taylor. We actually have safeguards. We've just never had the political will to fully enforce them. There are going to be people running through our community talking about how important 2020 is and getting out to vote. It damn sure is. And what we need to make sure we do as we're getting people out to vote is we need to make sure we're putting in place people that are going to enforce our nation's fair lending laws. Our nation's fair lending laws are there, they're powerful, and they have never been fully enforced. And when they get fully enforced, we will have the very outcomes that Dr. Taylor just mentioned. White Americans can trace, 20% of them can trace their wealth to the Homestead Act. 20% of them. We were brought here to work for free. And we cannot forget that point. Homeownership is the way, following the Great Recession, that most Americans built their wealth. $120 billion was invested in those communities. We only got 2% of those dollars. That means they got 98%. It's time for us to unapologetically ask for our fair share. We pay taxes on the dollars that they use to build their wealth. And this problem isn't only limited to homeownership. We're seeing this right now in the SBA PPP program, one of the largest transfers of wealth in our nation's history, and we're mostly locked out. And we have to demand our fair share and be unapologetic and pushing for basic plain vanilla practices in terms of mortgage lending that will help us be sustainable homeowners over time. We know it works for our community when it's done without the toxic abuses. We've worked to create a new mortgage market where those practices are mostly against the law. And now it's time for us to demand a fair share in investment and get that GSC, Restorative Justice Home Loan Guarantee Program. We should ask for it every time. And we all need to pick up the phone right now. And I don't see you all picking up your phones or sending emails. Pass heroes now.
Thank you. Dr. Harrell.
I want to focus on one thing, and that's choice and the limitations of choice. To me, this all boils down to that people have limited, African Americans in many communities have limited housing options. We've talked about some of those historical reasons. We've talked about some of the financial barriers. And so what we need to do is to expand choice. We need to protect the options that people have by a strong and strengthened Affordable Housing Act that affirmatively furthers the fair housing goals that we've set more than 50 years ago. We need to have the financial products that allow people to purchase the housing that they need. We need to have an approach at all levels of government to expand the zoning and housing options that are possible so that people can have the right kinds of options that fit their financial needs, their lifestyle needs, and other needs. We need to have the private sector models that can help people do that. And we need to drop the barriers so that we can expand solutions. The town hall committees and the other kinds of barriers that are hard to see sometimes that prevent people from actually building or designing or getting the housing options they need. So, there's a wide range of things we can do, but if we focus on the fact that this particular group of Americans, because of many historical reasons and other factors, has a limited set of options, and we think about how we can expand that choice, I think we'll be better off. And to do that, we're going to need place-based solutions that look at not just the whole city, but the African-American neighborhoods within the city. We need to look at those place-based solutions to do that. We need people-based solutions that look at the particular history and policies that prevent personal financial growth. And we need market-based solutions that bring that in. And so we as individuals, local and federal policymakers, and the private sector all have roles in making this happen. It'll take the proverbial village to solve this issue. And frankly, one of the reasons this is an issue to this day is because it's a complex issue. The solutions are complex. There's no silver bullets, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep trying. And so to find these solutions, we need to really think holistically about what we can do to move things forward and finally expand the choice of individuals. So we won't be talking in 50 more years about having limited choice, but instead about how wonderful it is that people are able to get their housing needs met and find the options that work best for them and their families.
Thank you. Before I go to our national president, Mr. Donnell Williams, I want to thank you all for your information. I want the audience to think about a couple of things that this panel has talked about. Number one is advocacy is so important, whether it's at the city level, at the state level, or federal level. At every stage, you have to be demanding that Black home ownership is on the table, that there's a neighborhood plan. If you don't know the plan for your neighborhood, I have a town meeting tonight in my neighborhood, and they're going to be talking about our neighborhood plan. A lot of Black neighborhoods, most people don't know there's not even a real plan that's up to date for 2020. You need to be involved in that. The other thing that was talked about is making sure that we get some federal and state policies that specifically help elevate African-American home ownership. It is not by accident that the two groups that have the lowest home ownership in the United States of America are the ones who had their land stolen, which is Native Americans, and the people who were stolen. And then for over 100 years, property burned, redlined, etc. So with all that, I want to bring up our 31st president, Mr. Donnell Williams. Thank you for allowing us to have this forum today, and you can close us out. Mr. Williams.
He was in between meetings, Edie Thompson. He may not be on the call.
All right. Well, folks, I want you all to tune in on Tuesday. Tuesday, we're going to have the next part of this conversation. We're going to talk about combating racism and discrimination in the real estate industry and in mortgage lending. This is going to be a heavy and a hot discussion. We can't build land without cash. Our people learned that the hard way coming out of Reconstruction. They gave us land and we were sharecroppers. They gave us property and they wouldn't give us a loan. They gave us businesses and we couldn't get fruit and vegetables to sell. So we need to deal with discrimination in real estate, in mortgage lending on Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you. God bless you. And the revolution has started. God bless you.